So look, I'm allergic to boring. If we're talking about the future, let's try and figure it out right now. There is no doubt in my mind, it's really easy to think about 20 years from today. It's pretty hard to figure out what the heck's gonna happen over the next few years. So let's try for 5 years as kind of one measurement. You know, where are we going? What is gonna happen? Because it's a big chaotic mess in many different areas. As I said from the podium, it's certainly a lot more organized. Well, let's jump right in and try to really hit on some power-packed sort of areas of what could be and what's not happening. Now, Xander, you practice, you practice in an M&A world. Let's start with the most recent great big acquisition that we all happened, which is the Canopy acreage. I'm delighted to say I'm pleased to know both of those teams, amazing teams. Talk to us because it's complicated and demystify that for us, and then take us, where is that going over the next few years on the M&A world?
Sure. Well, the Canopy acreage deal, you know, the story actually starts when Constellation Brands invested in Canopy back in August or September of last year. And Constellation put 5 billion Canadian into Canopy in order to acquire a substantial minority stake, as well as a warrant to acquire a majority stake, okay? So if you follow the process here, it starts to make sense. And so they just recently, last week I believe, announced their deal with Acreage, which is a $300 million option to acquire Acreage, as I understand it, at a fixed exchange ratio as between the Acreage shares and the Canopy shares. So to me, this deal is perhaps more significant to the cannabis industry even than Constellation's original deal, because this is the first time a major strategic non-cannabis player in the United States has found some path to exposure to United States-based, federally illegal cannabis. And it's a relatively tortured path, but if you follow the line, Constellation now has a direct option to acquire a major US player, because what they have the right to do when it becomes federally legal, Canopy has the right to acquire Acreage, and Constellation has the right to acquire a controlling interest in Canopy. So to my mind, this is really a Constellation deal as much as it is a Canopy deal, and it's a watershed moment in the sense that we now have an opening for major strategic players to take a piece of US-based cannabis, tangentially, okay, but there's that opening. And I view it as a significant wager on the part of Constellation Brands that we're gonna have federal legalization or decriminalization relatively soon.
Now, as long as you have the mic, I meant to have you give a little bit more about your background so people could know you and what you're working on. So talk us through just a little bit more of your background.
Sure. Well, you know, originally this was titled Crystal Balling the Future of Cannabis, so I guess that makes me a crystal baller.
Indeed.
Which I kind of like.
Yeah, why not?
But truth be told, if I had a crystal ball, you know, I probably wouldn't be practicing law, and I'm not so sure I'd be sharing all the secrets with you all, to be honest. But my background is I'm a corporate securities M&A private equity lawyer. I've been working with cannabis companies for 3 years and change, perhaps. Cannabis is probably half of what I do. At Greenspoon Martyr, I'm sure you've seen our booth. We're sponsors of Arcview, have been for some time. We're probably one of the most high-profile firms that work in the cannabis space. We're an AmLaw 200 firm, though. We do far more than just cannabis. What I think separates us from a lot of our competitors in the AmLaw 200 is we have a lot of cannabis regulatory lawyers in-house. Most of our competitors don't. And we have literally thousands of cannabis clients, from the kind of the high end, the very top, you know, the Curaleafs, Harvest of the world, down to, you know, mom and pop. So we have a very sophisticated corporate practice, but we also have a lot of street cred in the industry.
Let's stay on the M&A theme, though. As you heard earlier, Chris Crane, I thought, gave a wonderful overview about the risk of this crazy sector we're all in and the monopoly piece of it. What is going ahead? What is the crystal ball over the next, let's say, 5 years? What do you see happening now on these M&A transactions?
They're going to get bigger. They're going to get more sophisticated. I think that we have right now M&A deals that are in antitrust review, which that's probably a topic for another conversation. But there are large deals that are happening. You're reading about it, right? Cresco Origin, Harvest, Verano, but not just deal size. I think what's happening right now is you have a group of folks that are aggressively trying to become the leading players, so that when legalization or decriminalization happens, they're going to be juicy acquisition targets for a U.S.-based consumer branding company or something like that, the Coca-Colas of the world. But I also think you're going to have the analogy of the craft beers, right? You're going to have the big spirits companies are going to consolidate in a bunch of M&A activity, but then you'll still have the opportunity for craft brands and smaller brands, not to mention pharmaceuticals and all the other stuff.
We'll come back to that. Victor,
Sure.
give a little bit more about yourself, and let's get into some of these really, really interesting and important regulatory issues, especially around what's happening with beverages, with edibles.
So my name is Victor Jerez. I like that title of Crystal Baller. Crystal Balder, maybe. In any case, I've spent the past 15 years or so in alcohol, specifically in some of the top spirits companies in the world. So most recently, I was with William Grant, and you don't know who William Grant is, or maybe you do, but you hopefully know what Hendrick's Gin is, and Glenfiddich Single Malt Whiskey, Balvenie, Tullamore Dew, Monkey Shoulder. So some of the top premium spirits in the world. I was I was executive board member, chairman of one of their businesses. I was head of corporate strategy and M&A for them. Previous to that, I was with Pernod Ricard. Note the French pronunciation, Pernod Ricard. I was the head of corporate strategy and M&A globally for them. For 5 years, did some deals. Did some deals like Monkey 47 Premium Gin, Del Maguey, which is a kick-ass mezcal, which I would highly recommend, a bunch of other brands, and was not able to do the Beam deal because that was bought by Suntory, Japanese players, for $16 billion. Previous to that, I was in operations and general management positions. Recently, as of less than 60 days, actually, I jumped over into the cannabis space and joined Lighthouse, particularly because actually I was on stage with the founder in Chicago, on stage in Arcview. And the proposition of creating an alt-alc resonated, because having spent so much time in the alcohol industry, I could see that the broad trends that are being faced in alcohol, actually broader trends than alcohol itself, health and wellness, where dry January is a thing and people drink less and less, which actually was okay for the companies that I was working with because we were premium. So you drink less, but higher price products, more premium products work towards our favor. But coming up with an alternative which allows you to have a social, quote unquote, elevated experience without some of the pitfalls of alcohol, which we know where they are, to go from the least of which is its calories, hangover, and on, I thought was a real winning proposition. So done that transition rather recently.
But one thing I'm fascinated with, something we talked about, what's going to happen now with edibles and with the regulatory issues around those?
Regulatory. So when I was at Pernod Ricard, one of the roles I had also was head of audit globally. So I put together the risk chart, and guess what is the biggest risk that all these alcohol companies face? Regulatory risk. So coming into the cannabis space, and I do know I come on with the perspective of the alcohol industry, the biggest threat is the regulatory bodies clamping down on product classes. And I love high contribution margin products. I love them, right? They give you so much freedom in terms of branding. And the speaker before who said 20% of net sales on A&P, advertising promotion, spot on, absolutely. That's the number. So Pernod Ricard spent about $2.5 billion per year on their brands. There's a hard line in alcohol. It's called LDA. What's LDA? Legal drinking age. You do not go near LDA. You stay away from it because that is poking the bear. And one of the brands in the portfolio, Malibu, we were trying to steer it away from the 16, 17, 18, 21-year-olds. Just get it up and out of there. Because all you need is for the regulator to look at that and say that's a kiddie product and that's a stupefactant and you're out. Just look at what happened to Joe Camel. Gone, right? So, look, from my perspective, I get it. Edibles, gummies, brownies, all that stuff. Yeah, it's great. You know, it's a fantastic contribution margin per unit. But one of my crystal balling is that if it's not played right, the regulators will come in, and they're not going to come in with a fine paintbrush and paint that out. No, they're just going to slap it out and say, gone. Candies, cookies, all that stuff, goodbye.
So you think all that's going away in time? 5 years, 20 years, where are we on that scale?
I think it just takes one 6-year-old to open up a package of 100 milligram chocolate, because 6-year-olds are very adept. I've had two, now they're 18 and 21. They're adept in getting into little spaces, and they're not going to read that big triangle with a marijuana leaf. They're not going to get it, and they're going to get in there, they're going to eat the whole thing, they're going to end up in the hospital, and more than likely they won't die, which is a great thing, but the regulator will come right down on that. So I'm predicting sooner rather than later, unless the codes of the product change. I know it's a pretty radical view, but, and I am biased.
Let's stay on beverages and edibles for a little bit more. Tegan, I saw your overview. You've built some amazing things so quickly, and you're Canadian. So I'd love first your input. First, give a little overview more so people can understand what you're building. And then take us there on your view about some of these edibles, beverages, and all in Canada. I think it's interesting. And where is it going over 5 years, then 20?
Okay, sure. Thanks, Jean. All right, so my background is I have a master's in agricultural economics. I've worked as an independent management consultant for about 10 years, and in 2014, quite a few of my clients that were from universities and government that were working with agricultural technologies started listing themselves on the CSE and doing RTOs with a lot of the mining companies, and that's primarily how I started in the industry. I found there was a huge labor gap. I launched a university course here at Kwantlen University, taught over 400 students in the first year. It was the first cannabis course in Canada, and that's when I got recruited to a Health Canada lab, which is where we did quality assurance and testing for, I had 1,500 clients in pharmaceuticals, primarily some cosmetics, natural health products, and that's where cannabis came in. There was 150 submissions that we reviewed, and I've seen behind the scenes of a lot of the big companies and the small ones in Canada. I think it's interesting if you look at the way manufacturing supply chains work all over the world. Everyone had somewhere to start. So even though the FDA standard is primarily one that's recognized as affiliated with the USA, for example, you find FDA accredited facilities all over the world. And I think that if you're looking at the Canadian market right now and Canada as it compares to other countries, I think Canada's largest strength is the good manufacturing practices and the regulatory side on the operational part of the businesses. And what we're likely going to see is that quality standard is going to become very important, especially because, as you two are saying, the regulatory risk is one of the larger ones, and no one wants a recall and no one wants something planted in their product. I think as we look at where that means food, beverage, and other products are going to go, I'm torn because in Canada, CBD and THC are bundled together. They're considered products that we don't really have a good safety profile for, that we feel comfortable telling people that they can have them. And the government was kind of pushed through various political and court cases to do what they're doing now and didn't really like it along the way, right? But I think if you look also at natural health product industries and you separate out something like THC from CBD, I think that it's likely that as things sort of shake out, CBD could get regulated more similarly to something like turmeric, for example, or ginseng, where there's a whole bunch of genetics profiles that are very highly sought after. So that was something, for example, when I worked at the lab, you'd have people showing up saying, can you test this strain of ginseng or this certain specific type of turmeric, because we're getting it from China or we're getting it from India or Africa or South America or wherever, and we want to make sure that it's pure and true. So I think that perhaps CBD could go in that direction. It'll be more of a raw material that's used as an anti-inflammatory, for example, and other health benefits that people pull studies forward on. And I think that THC could be more similar to alcohol, and that's really how a lot of things are regulated right now in Canada, in particular because of the THC having that psychoactive element. So that's my
But do you,
guess.
do you also plan to play in the edibles world once Canada allows that? So,
Yeah.
So do you have a view about what's going to happen? As you
Yeah.
heard Victor says, better be careful, so many issues related to kids and inappropriate products that aren't right. What's your view of what's going to happen? Are they around for good? Are they going away?
I don't think they're going to go away, in all honesty, in Canada. I can see your perspective 100% in the USA. In Canada, everything, every kid, well, I don't want to say every kid, but, who didn't get into their parents' sherry cabinet or something? Like people get into the alcohol cabinet when they're kids, and I think maybe it'll happen that a kid gets into a cannabis product. Here, the packaging restrictions are so strict, and the way things are packaged up together, it's very hard. Everything's childproof. It's very hard for someone to get in, and it's a lot different than a lot of the products that you see in the States and other countries in Europe. I'm sometimes shocked. Like I always say, if I can open it, it's not childproof. So,
So because you're active, cultivating, building a number of different operations, and you just mentioned GMP, we are completely silly on a number of counts in the U.S., and GMP doesn't roll off the tongues. It needs to. I want to hear your crystal ball about GMP. First of all, explain to us what's going on in that view for Canada. We certainly know in Europe that's a standard. What's the future even for the U.S.? Are we going to get with it? What's your view on that?
okay, so GMP, or good manufacturing practices, is primarily a pharmaceutical-based accreditation, right? I think just like, I think again, natural health products and cosmetics are a good example. You don't have to be a GMP accredited facility, but if you want to supply a large volume of product to a mainstream brand or other company, like a pharmaceutical one, or something that's international, then you will be. So I think it's interesting to see what's going on in Canada and the States in terms of regulatory, as well as the lab testing standards is another big one right now. It sort of seems like it's a race who can get the best reference standard accredited, and that's, that person's going to win. I think a lot of the standards right now are reliant on the labs catching up. And that's sort of something that I worked on as well, was acquisitions of cannabis labs for an international lab group that they have now over 250. They buy about 25 a year. And we went looking at it, and the hardest problem we found was that the GMP standards and the reference standards weren't all linked up at the lab level. So I think that, over time, the people that want to have those big supply contracts will likely go GMP, and those that don't want to, they want to keep it simple, just make a little bit of money, but enough, they probably won't.
So keep it simple. You may not need it as a standard. I would expect it to be pervasive in the U.S. over time. So many states don't even demand testing of products. This is complete craziness. And also, I was surprised to learn, because this is really important to understand, I feel. Not every LP in Canada even adopts GMP standard. Is that going to change? Is that the future? Even some of the large LPs, right?
I think so. So it really depends on the business model and where people are selling. You don't have to have it. The GPP, the good production practices that cannabis companies follow, are really, they're a subset of the pharmaceutical ones. So what people are doing already, just to have their license and be compliant, is really quite strict already. So to get the GMP is really sort of the next level, and that would sort of imply that you're going to go to the export market. So or a large pharmaceutical or cosmetic buyer, and I don't think everyone will do that. There's still, I met with one group. I'm from Salt Spring Island originally, and they sort of did everything very small and slow. It took them 5 years to get a license. They weren't in a rush, and their general view is not to bother, because they've got already a craft brand. So I think it'll really depend on the preference of the business owners.
All right, open our minds about cultivation in general, since that's your world. What is going to happen over time? Let's say over the next 5 years. Let's start there. It's obviously heading toward a commodity. How do you manage through that? What's your view of the next few years, 5 years, on that world?
So the next 5 years on cultivation? Okay, well, I think definitely right now the game is sort of global domination. Everyone's sort of saying, we're going to this country, that country, and next, and wanting to be a platform for global brands. I think what you're going to find is a lot of the traditional ways that, for example, mining companies or other extraction groups used to look for their next site and the security and the sort of political situation. I think those companies are going to come in and help us find the next best places to go. And I think, in all honesty, I find that the most difficult thing. We get approached, I'm not, like every day by a new country. Someone shows up and says they have a license and they can produce weed for 25 cents a gram and come to my country. And then you sort of bump into the ministers, right? They say $2 million to my account and we'll let you try for a license. So I do think these countries are going to come online, but I think there's going to be a lot more security along the logistics and supply chain.
Now, notice you started this conversation with everybody. You mean everybody in Canada, because again, I'm astonished that we are such laggards in the U.S. So are we going to get with it and get our exporting together? Do you have a view on that?
Okay, I don't know if you're laggards. I've seen some of the American companies marketing in London, and what I've noticed so far...
We're laggards.
I've seen that they market themselves as American only, and they're not necessarily interested in partnering with companies internationally because they're the States and they feel that they have a large enough population and enough money to just ramp out the guns. But that being said, I mean, it really is going to depend what volume. I think there's still going to be some companies that are going to look in other countries to find the cheaper manufacturing, and whether or not they can do it in another country is really going to be the question. And I think that over time, it does feel like the banking laws are changing, the regulatory side is changing. Hemp versus cannabis is finally going to get shaken out. So
looking at cultivation over the next few years, you can see huge volume needs, big exporting needs, if you already explained. But what about now? Let's jump to 20 years. What's going on in Canada in cultivation in 20 years? What's your view?
20 years cultivation in Canada. I think it's going to shake out a bit to see who the real operators were relative to a lot of the companies that are primarily run by bankers and lawyers. I think that's really going to be the differentiator. A lot of the companies that have taken off with these multi-billion-dollar valuations and made a lot of money on the security side are not necessarily the companies that are going to stay in the game to provide product to the marketplace. So I think it's going to be interesting to see who can stay as an operator and provide product and not just a securities or share buy.
So winners and losers again. As you spoke about it, Sander, the M&A will continue to gobble up these licenses. I'm sure there's plenty of room for new players. Do you agree?
Well, absolutely. And echoing a prior panel I was on, in 20 years, will there even be cultivation in Canada?
Will there be? What's
right?
your view?
I mean, does it make a whole lot of sense to be cultivating at the price that, or the cost of production in Canada versus the cost of production in Colombia, right? So in 20 years, we're probably seeing a much more international market. In terms of, what was your follow-on question?
So what is going to happen, and are there more and more new entrants, or has the, have the front runners now ahead of them in the marathon race? Or is there room for more to play and all?
I think there's room for more. I mean, I think a lot of the easy money has been made, but that doesn't mean that there aren't room for more players. I mean, I grew up in sort of I got out of law school and started practicing corporate securities laws during the first dot-com bubble, and those are fun times, right? Because anything with a .com on it was suddenly $1 billion company, and there are certain analogies that you can easily make between the first tech bubble and the kind of the current state of the cannabis market. But I would also observe that a lot of the current winners, a lot of the long-term players in the technology space weren't around during that first technology bubble. Facebook wasn't formed until 2004. Google was barely in its incubancy during when the first bubble crashed, right? And so I'm not sure that the long-term cannabis winners have even been formed yet, but
Right.
There's definitely, I think it's pretty obvious that with production capacity coming online, there's a greater and greater premium being paid to quality operators, right? Margins are coming down. There's a lot less room for error.
Sure. Now, to your point, I am a contrarian and unafraid of all these big tech, big bank, big everybody coming in, big pharma, because just like you were saying, in tech, that's when people who knew how to fill the gap did that. Mara, I want to go to you. So you probably all know Mara Gordon, fabulous engineer, scientist, creator of products. So I asked her to join in this very subject about what is ahead for cultivation, because the audience wants to know, and this is a big subject matter for my brain, what about biosynthesis? Are we going to make these cannabinoids in a petri dish, and is that the future? So I asked Amara to just give a little couple sentences on that. Take my mic, though, and come on up here. Nothing like a lifeline in the audience, right? Yeah, okay,
Thank
good.
you. Hi.
So I'd like you to speak to that. Are the cultivators gonna go away? As you know, that's how big pharma operates. You know, vitamin C and everything else it's made in a big factory, not in some field. So talk to us about that.
So the way I feel about this, and based upon experience and based upon what I'm seeing trends, cannabis is going to go down two routes on not talking the recreational, not talking the replacement of THC for alcohol, but just talking about where the huge opportunity, which is of course in medical. Pharma is the biggest industry in the world, and there's a reason for it. That's where people spend the most money. And you're going to have pharmaceutical type products that are coming out where people are taking either synthetic, biosynthetic, or organic cannabinoids, which from a molecular standpoint are identical, whether they come from yeast or algae or cannabis or from a laboratory themselves, and they're going to use those to create products, adding terpenes, et cetera. And they're going to have limited capability, and some of those will make it through FDA. But you also see more the nutraceutical route, which is really where I believe that cannabis has its, as a biopharmaceutical more than a straight pharmaceutical opportunity. And then using some of these synthetics and using some of these single molecule compounds, that, pure compounds, using those to offset and standardize some of these whole plant products. For example, and I used this the other day, if you're doing a whole plant extraction and you're actually trying to standardize a product at a mass level, and you have slight variances, for example, from plant to plant. I don't care how good we get at growing this plant. The top buds are different than the middle buds, different than the bottom buds. Anyone that's been cultivating for years knows you can standardize everything, but there's just too many different, how many feet away from the fan the plant is sitting or where it is to the light can augment what the actual outcome of that plant is. So to use the biosynthetics to then standardize, like let's say you want something that's like 9.2 milligram, or you want it to be 10 milligrams per milliliter on a standard product, and then you do your manufacturing, you have your large thing, and it's at 9.2 or 9.3. To standardize it and level it off using the biosynthetic or using some sort of a single molecule is not going to significantly alter the medicine, and it's a marriage of the both, and you need both for that thing.
So what I learned from you in that great overview that you and your colleagues did on science is it is going to be there, but for a very narrow subsector of these kinds of medicine, really, to fix certain health issues, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think that on the recreational market, you're already seeing a lot of people using like single molecule. They're using distillates that have been refined down to where they may as well be isolates, and then they're adding in 3 or 4 fake terpenes or plant-deprived terpenes. And there's limited market for those because you end up with things like the person becomes dose resistant very quickly. They have to keep increasing. They end up having to take in artificial things into their lungs or into their bodies that they don't necessarily need to. So I think that those products are going to fall by the wayside as we have more standards moving forward.
One follow-up. So we all know that the hemp bill opened the door in the U.S., came off Schedule 1, but you do know this, that the rules and regs around CBD have not been declared. So it's left everything in a gray area. What is the future crystal ball on CBD? Is the FDA going to put their grimy hands all over it? Are they going to delay it? Are they going to capture those products, take them away from us? No way. Talk to us about the future there. Yes.
Okay. So my crystal ball, though I have lots of hair, my crystal ball on CBD is, first of all, it breaks my heart that it was ever singled out as a single molecule. And that, I'm not even going to mention the family and people that were behind that disaster that has been for the whole world, really, that have CBD be singled out as if it's somehow separate instead of being part of this whole plant. I do think that we are going to end up with in the US, we're going to end up with a federally legal, eventually, hopefully descheduled, and then really, really seriously controlled by the FDA. And I think CBD will be treated the same way. I think as CBD, or as cannabis itself becomes legal in the United States, which of course then the World Health Organization will then roll out in the United Nations and all the other countries that are being limited in what they're allowing, I think hemp will go back to being a fiber, a fuel, and all these things, and we'll go back to cannabis being the sourcing for CBD.
Thank you so much, Mara. All right, Sander, back to the U.S. and our silliness. The States Act, do you have a view? When's it going to pass? What's it going to do for us? Are we finally going to make things happen?
So we have a full-time cannabis lobbyist in our DC office, which is somewhat unique among law firms. And I don't personally have a view, but I can share a little bit of intel. The States Act is, well, you've got a number of different proposals that are at various stages in the kind of congressional review process. And one of the things I found particularly interesting on an update call from our lobbyist to our larger cannabis working group within the firm was the States Act is not universally supported by the groups you might think would support that bill. And the reason is politics, right? A lot of the groups that are pro-legalization don't think the States Act goes far enough, and so they are considering opposing it, and in the hopes that they will have more quickly something even better, right? And so is the States Act, I don't personally have a better point of view than probably anybody else here that's looked into it, but I think, in terms of crystal balling the future, something along those lines is going to pass at some point.
And what's the some point in your brain?
I'm going to defer to the numbers crunchers at Constellation Brands and say that we're going to get something good in the next few years. I don't think they would put down a $300 million deposit on a 2 or 3 level removed acquisition of a company if they didn't think it was happening in the next couple of years.
So, Tegan, because you're building so much, you obviously have to buy, acquire, install a lot of technology. Love your view about technology. I, myself, longtime tech investor, grew up with all those unbelievable platforms over time that were once primitive. I am personally astonished at the primitive nature of technology in the dispensaries, in the cultivators, in the field. Talk to us about your view on that. Where is that going over 5 and then 20 years?
So technology, okay. I think it's interesting the people that show up at least to talk to us about doing studies together or testing something. You're seeing just sort of like you saw the wave of blockchain and crypto, now you're seeing the wave of AI come in. So there's a lot of people showing up with robotics technologies, things that are monitoring plants and looking at how well they're doing in exchange to their nutrient management portfolio and their lighting management and linking it all together and really taking some very interesting 3D cuts of the plants. I think a lot of things are going to happen with robots and AI in particular. I think it'll take some time, but if you're looking at 5 to 20 years, I think a lot of that's going to come in, especially as people get better and better at making robots that are closer and closer to acting like a human, which is terrifying in a lot of respects. And you're definitely going to see more labor jobs shifting out, but
yeah. Because you have such a big operation, are you actively buying those kinds of platforms now, Or are you wait and see? Are they able to get the job done today with what's out there?
Our general approach is to always test something with a group before we would buy something. There's some things that a lot of people are kind of, especially the growers, and we always like to support the growers and the production staff. A lot of them are really set in their ways in some specific methods that they know work. But we will always test something against that best practice that we have to see if it can do it better. We'd be foolish not to. So we're not necessarily grabbing up robots right now, but we are working with companies and talking to companies about, how can those technologies work and what's the baseline that they need to beat? Because that's really going to be it. Can you make us more money with your robot, or are we going to go through? Canada's also got migrant worker programs. To the comments on Colombia and other developing countries, what's happening is because those countries are dangerous, is that the government is subsidizing groups to come up from those countries and work in Canada where it's safer, and they come up all together, and they like it, and they get to go home, once or twice a year as part of their job. So I think, in terms of what we do, we're always open to talking to new groups and testing things, but it's gotta work before we're gonna buy it.
Xander, because you're in the mecca of both cannabis and technology, being in LA, what are you seeing? Are you seeing lots of tech entrepreneurs coming to you for both IP, for securities needs? What's happening from your view?
I mean, there's a natural marriage, I think, between technology and cannabis. I mean, it's the same entrepreneurial spirit that's driving both. So, we've seen people that are pushing, crypto solutions to banking and that sort of thing. And when I look at the future of cannabis, kind of reminds me of that that old joke about airplanes, right? When they said the airplane cockpit of the future would consist of a computer, a pilot, and a dog. The computer existed to fly the plane, the pilot existed to feed the dog, and the dog existed to bite the pilot in case he ever dared touch the computer, right? And I feel like cultivation will be that way, right? We'll have robots cultivating the stuff. We're going to have a guy sitting in the corner feeding the dog to make sure, and dog's going to bite if he ever touches the robots. But that also, to me, that's for the product that requires an extraordinarily high degree of specificity or extraordinarily low tolerance for error, right? You're going to have the commodity level product. You're going to have the stuff that eventually will be cultivated in Colombia. It doesn't necessarily have to be enormously consistent, from batch to batch. And then you're going to have the real high-end consumer product, and ultimately the pharmaceutical grade stuff, which has to be cultivated and manufactured, produced to a much finer tolerance, right? And that's going to be where technology, I think, really is a differentiating factor.
I think there's lots of opportunity for great platforms, quality platforms, and a big need. I'm really quite astonished that it is what it is, but that means opportunity for business owners, investors, and all. Now, again, I'm fascinated with exporting, and you're the one, Tegan, who mentioned that. What is the future for Europe? Talk about what you see. Is that your plan to export, or you're not quite doing that yet, are you?
Right now in Canada, we're selling at a higher price locally because there's a shortage with a lot of the larger
Okay.
LPs. So we are getting ready to export. We have some auditors coming next month to get the EU part of the EU GMP. But at the moment, it hasn't been as much of a priority to add that extra money in to get the standard because we're selling for such a high price locally. It really depends on the company again, I think, and what their sort of plan is. On our side, we have both, we have 3 facilities. So one facility is specialized in craft flower, and the other 2 are more on the medical side and the economy to scale for an oil producer to go into edibles and the beverage space as a starting point. So we can look at the export markets, but I think it would be foolish to say that those, Germany in particular, people will start producing their own, right? And it's gonna be, in that case, I think it'll kind of be a lot like wine and coffee, where different regions get known for different kinds of wine and coffee that everyone wants. And you have your little flavor profile and a picture of the farmer and a map that shows where, it was produced. I think it'll start to look a lot more like that over time, despite the potential separation of CBD and THC.
Well, because of Canada's early, get to market faster than anybody and leadership, are they going to be the major exporters?
Well, I think that's a policy and a regulatory race. So Health Canada doesn't tend to like a lot of product being transported. You do have people like Kuehne+Nagel and large pharmaceutical logistics companies that are around that you can get to help you with some of this stuff. But in general, I haven't seen too much of a high volume that's going back and forth really across the borders. There's press releases that make it look like there are, but whether or not those amounts are profitable or sustainable is another question. And that was a big, a lot of that was the mining company executives that were in it. Like they were following things that they were used to doing in mining. So that it was who's going to be first to go to Uruguay, and everything else. So I think, it will be a global market, and I think a lot of it will depend on the different social parts of each country that likes what.
Sure. Let's close with going down the line with some big, bold predictions. Just go wild for us. Xander, you start. What do you think could be? Pick any time frame. 5 years, 20 years. What's the
Legalization via tweet.
Oh, I love it. Hey, I like that. That's good. That's good.
Actually,
And coming out of you-know-who in Washington.
Actually, I think the it's very hard to make bold predictions when they're made for you every time you open up the Wall Street Journal. I think so. And it's the bold prediction is really not very bold. It's I come from largely a Wall Street, Silicon Valley style background, and generally speaking, the shortest distance between 2 points in other industries is a straight line. Cannabis is not, because there's so many obstacles, and I think just those obstacles are starting to fall away.
Victor, what's ahead?
Yeah, my prediction is that those obstacles will fall away very, very quickly. I've had a thesis that there's going to be a convergence between alcohol and cannabis. I think that'll happen very quickly. Constellation's moves are a clear example of their belief in that thesis. I think that we'll see, essentially, I'm talking about the recreational space, adult use space right now, is that there's going to be a similar model. I think that those that vie for, you can talk about beverages, share of throat, or those that vie for share of high will own the space quickly. So I think there'll be consolidation by the major players. They have the balance sheet that occupy that space in alcohol. I think that's going to drive changes in terms of route to market. I think it'll be within the next 10 years. Maybe I'm hopeful, maybe even sooner. Once federal legalization comes down, I think there will be a convergence of bars and cannabis products will be widely available. I'm talking about THC products. So I think that this reefer madness notion that, oh my God, if you twist alcohol and cannabis, you're going to go crazy. I think that's going to fall away very quickly, and you'll find that those consumption spaces will be open to products.
So big spirits, big beer companies,
Most
big
definitely.
everybody running the show, and vape lounges, and all kinds of goodies available.
And just to
at the
touch
same
back
time.
on technology, and I think that there's a really interesting future to come where right now alcohol companies, and I know I've been there, mapping out the portfolio strategy. They're going to be brand houses, just like the companies that I work for. They map out the different brands by occasion and consumer. Right? And basically that's driven by the 20% or more of net sales that they're spending on advertising promotion. I think there's a brave new world once the research comes online, is allowed, to actually create products of different experiences that map right into our current consumption habits of elevating products.
Imagine the Super Bowl ads in 10 years.
Yes.
There you go. That's a good one. Tegan, big, bold, audacious prediction.
All right, I think half of me wants to just say, catch a plane to Amsterdam and check it out because things have been going on there for a long time. But I think it would be really neat. Something's going to change at the treaty level with the UN and how cannabis is scheduled. Number one, I think that'll happen. And number two, I think over time it'll be fun to see something like a CBD ginger ale in the hospital when you're sick, and something like a THC cocktail in the airport lounge before you go on a plane. And I think that those two areas, if the hospitals and the airports, like Air Canada Lounge or someone, lets it in, I think that means it's gone. It's gone through.
I love it. Here's mine. Before the 2020 election, The U.S. is going to blow the doors off of this, and we're finally going to get in the game. I know that for sure. You heard it here first, and please help me thank Sander, Tager, Vicken, and Mara. Thank you so much.